He said she was just a teacher. Then her student read a letter in court, and everyone went silent. Prepare yourself. This ending hits deep. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects as Margaret Sullivan swept the last of the autumn leaves from the cracked concrete walkway. Her weathered hands gripped the worn broom handle knuckles white against the splintered wood. The morning air in Chicago cut through her thin cardigan, but she didn't notice. She'd grown numb to small discomforts years ago. Behind her, Lincoln Elementary School loomed like a forgotten promise, its brick facade stained with decades of neglect. Windows were patched with duct tape, and the flagpole stood crooked, its rope frayed and dancing in the wind. Margaret paused, at the entrance fishing for her keys with fingers that trembled from more than just cold. At 62, she'd been unlocking this same door for 34 years, but today felt different. Today felt like an ending she wasn't ready to face. The hallways echoed with her solitary footsteps as she made her way to room 14B. The walls, once painted cheerful yellow, had faded to the color of old newspapers. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like abstract art nobody wanted to see. Margaret pushed open her classroom door and surveyed her kingdom. 28 mismatched desks, half held together with silver tape. A blackboard so old it had turned green, and bulletin boards she'd decorated with her own money. She'd arrived an hour early as always to prepare for her fifth graders. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the room with the only warmth she could afford. Her paycheck barely covered rent and groceries, but somehow she always found money. For extra supplies, winter coats that mysteriously appeared in the lost and found, and snacks for kids who came to school hungry. Nobody knew about the nights she ate cereal for dinner, so Tommy Rodriguez could have a proper lunch. The first warning came disguised as progress. Principal Grayson strode into her classroom, unannounced, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum. At 35, he possessed the kind of polished confidence that came from never having doubted himself. His suit cost more than Margaret's monthly salary, and he wore it like armor against the poverty surrounding him. He surveyed her room with barely concealed disgust, nose wrinkling at the familiar smell of old books and hand sanitizer. "Miss Sullivan," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss your classroom management." His eyes lingered. On her bulletin board, where student artwork hung proudly beside faded motivational posters. "This aesthetic is tired. We're implementing a more modern, standardized approach." Margaret felt her stomach drop, but managed a polite smile. "I'd be happy to make any necessary changes, Mr. Grayson." He didn't acknowledge her response, already turning toward the door. "Oh, and Margaret. Try to look more professional. First impressions matter." The door closed behind him with finality, leaving Margaret alone with the sting of his words and the growing certainty that her world was about to change. The attacks came slowly at first, then with increasing frequency. Grayson reassigned her to the most challenging classes without additional support. He eliminated her planning period, forcing her to grade papers during lunch while other teachers rested. During staff meetings, he'd single her out with comments designed to humiliate. Some educators, he'd say, looking directly at her, seem resistant to progress. They cling to outdated methods because change requires effort they're unwilling to invest. Margaret's colleagues looked away, grateful not to be in his crosshairs. She began arriving even earlier, staying even later, desperately trying to meet impossible standards. Her lesson plans grew longer, her self-doubt deeper. The joy she'd once found in teaching dimmed like a candle in the wind. Students noticed her. Distraction her forced smiles. Parents stopped by less frequently. The very foundation of her identity, being a good teacher, crumbled beneath Grayson's relentless criticism. She started questioning every decision, second-guessing methods that had worked for decades. Sleep became elusive, replaced by anxiety that gnawed at her empty stomach. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. Margaret found herself standing before Grayson's desk like a child called to the principal's office. His secretary, Mrs. Chen, wouldn't meet her eyes, a bad sign that made Margaret's chest tighten. Grayson didn't look up from his computer screen. As he spoke, his voice clinical and detached. "Due to budget constraints and restructuring initiatives, your position has been eliminated effective immediately." The words hit her like physical blows. 34 years of service reduced to corporate. Speak. Security will escort you to collect your personal items, he continued, finally looking at her with eyes cold as January wind. Your final paycheck will be mailed. Margaret opened her mouth to ask about her students, about the Christmas play they'd been rehearsing, about the science fair projects due next week. But Grayson had already dismissed her, returning to his screen as if she'd never existed. The security guard, Mr. Peters, touched her arm gently. He'd been at Lincoln almost as long as she had, and his weathered face reflected her own devastation. Together they walked the hallway that had been her second home, past classrooms full of children who would wonder where she'd gone. Margaret's apartment felt smaller that evening, the silence more oppressive than usual. She sat wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, staring at the cardboard box containing her career, a coffee mug that read, "World's Best Teacher," a collection of thank you notes from students, and a small cactus that had somehow survived on her windowsill for 12 years. The heating bill lay unopened on her kitchen table, alongside a notice about rent increase. At 62, with no family and limited savings, starting over seemed impossible. She'd dedicated her life to other people's children, and now she faced the terrifying reality of having nothing left for herself. The loneliness pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Outside, Chicago's winter wind rattled her windows, and she pulled the quilt tighter, trying to remember what hope felt like. Have you ever felt completely forgotten by the people you served? Share your experience in the comments. Everything changed the day the process server appeared at her door. Margaret stared at the legal documents with growing horror, the words blurring through her tears. Grayson was suing her for defamation, claiming she'd leaked confidential emails that exposed his plan to replace veteran teachers with younger, cheaper staff. The amount he sought would destroy her financially, cost her the tiny apartment that represented her only security. She hadn't leaked anything. Those emails had been accidentally sent to the entire faculty during a system glitch. But Grayson needed a scapegoat, and Margaret was convenient, vulnerable, and unlikely to fight back. The lawsuit made local news with a brief mention buried on page 6, former teacher faces defamation charges. No context, no investigation, just another story of someone's life falling apart. Margaret sat in her kitchen that night, the legal papers spread before her like a death sentence, and for the first time in her adult life she truly understood what it meant to be powerless. The courtroom felt cavernous and hostile, its oak paneling and formal atmosphere designed to intimidate. Margaret sat at the defendant's table in her only good dress, a navy blue garment she'd owned for 15 years. Her court-appointed attorney was young, overworked, and clearly outmatched by Grayson's team of expensive lawyers in their matching suits. Grayson himself sat confidently across the aisle, occasionally whispering to his counsel with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never doubted his victory. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, reviewed the case file with professional detachment. As the proceedings began, Margaret felt invisible, reduced to a footnote in Grayson's narrative of justified action. Her entire career, her decades of service, her love for teaching, none of it seemed to matter in this sterile environment where everything came down to legal technicalities and financial damages. She watched her former principal take the stand, describing her as a disgruntled employee prone to vindictive behavior, and felt pieces of her soul crumble with each calculated lie. The testimony continued for hours, each witness painting Margaret as bitter, incompetent, and dangerous. Grayson's lawyers called former colleagues who'd been coached to emphasize her resistant attitude and unprofessional conduct. They presented her personnel file highlighting every minor criticism while ignoring decades of positive evaluations. Margaret's attorney objected weakly, but the damage accumulated like sediment in a river. She began to believe the portrait they painted. Maybe she had been a failure. Maybe her students deserved better. Maybe her dismissal was justified. The weight of their words pressed down on her shoulders until she felt herself shrinking in her chair. When court recessed for lunch, she sat alone in the hallway watching families and lawyers hurry past with purpose while she remained frozen in place. The afternoon session would determine her fate, and she had no reason to believe justice would prevail. Her small savings were already depleted by legal fees, and regardless of the verdict, she was ruined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a recess, Margaret noticed a young man in a worn blazer sitting in the back of the courtroom. Something about his face seemed familiar, but she couldn't place him. He'd been taking notes throughout the morning session, his expression growing increasingly agitated as he listened to the testimony against her. When court resumed, Grayson's lead attorney delivered a particularly vicious closing argument describing Margaret as a pathetic figure clinging to relevance and a teacher who'd failed her students as completely as she'd failed herself. The words echoed through the chamber like poison, and Margaret felt her last reserves of dignity crumbling. She was about to lose everything, her reputation, her savings, her sense of self-worth. But then the young man stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the attorney's rhetoric. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I have something to say about Miss Sullivan." The judge looked surprised but intrigued. "And you are?" she asked. "My name is David Chen, and Margaret Sullivan saved my life." The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and electric. David walked to the front with purpose, pulling a folded letter from his jacket pocket. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice grew stronger with each word. "I was 10 years old when my father died in a construction accident." He began looking directly at Margaret. "My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, and I spent most afternoons alone. I was angry, lost, falling behind in school." He paused, gathering courage. "Miss Sullivan noticed. She started staying late to help me with homework, bringing me books. She thought I'd enjoy listening when I needed to talk. She never made me feel like charity." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as memories flooded back. David, sullen and withdrawn, gradually opening up over shared love of science fiction novels. "One day I told her I wanted to disappear. I meant it. She looked me in the eye and said, 'The world needs what you have to offer, David. Don't rob us of that gift.' She arranged for counseling, helped me apply for scholarships, and never let me believe I was alone." David's voice broke slightly. "I'm now a social worker because of her example. She didn't just teach me reading and math, she taught me that I mattered." As David spoke, something magical happened in the courtroom. Other figures began emerging. From the gallery, former students who'd quietly slipped in during the trial. One by one they approached the bench, each carrying their own story of how Margaret had changed their lives. Sarah, now a nurse, told how Margaret had noticed her bruises and gently reported suspected abuse, ultimately leading to her rescue from a dangerous home. Michael, a successful engineer, described how Margaret had convinced him to apply for college despite his family's skepticism. Jennifer, a young mother, shared how Margaret had attended her high school graduation when her own parents couldn't be bothered. The stories poured forth like water through a broken dam, each testimony more powerful than the last. Margaret sat in, stunned silence, tears streaming down her face, as she realized the depth of impact she'd never fully understood. These weren't just former students, they were lives she'd touched, futures she'd helped shape, souls she'd helped heal. The courtroom had become something unprecedented, a testament to the power of quiet heroism. The judge, visibly moved, allowed each person to speak despite the irregular procedure. Grayson's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by growing unease, as he realized his carefully constructed case was collapsing. His lawyers whispered urgently among themselves, but there was no legal strategy to combat truth spoken from the heart. The final speaker was Maria Santos, now a teacher herself, who described how Margaret had given her family groceries during a particularly difficult winter, disguising the charity as extras from the school program. "She never wanted credit, Maria," said her voice ringing with conviction. "She just wanted to help. That's who she is, someone who sees need and responds, who loves without condition, who teaches not just curriculum but humanity." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of crying throughout the gallery. Durakure looked around the courtroom, finally understanding that she hadn't been forgotten after all. She'd been deeply, permanently remembered by the people who mattered most. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Not only was the defamation case dismissed, but she issued a scathing rebuke of Grayson's conduct and ordered him to pay Margaret's legal fees. More importantly, the judge used her position to shine a spotlight on the treatment of veteran educators calling for a review of district policies regarding teacher dismissal. The local media, initially indifferent to the case, suddenly found themselves covering a story that resonated far beyond the courtroom. Within hours, social media had picked up David's testimony, and Margaret's story began spreading across the country. Donations poured in from strangers moved by her plight, enough to secure her apartment, pay her bills, and provide a small cushion for the future. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that her life had mattered, that her work had created ripples extending far beyond her modest classroom. As she left the courthouse that day, surrounded by former students who'd become successful adults, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten: pride in her calling. The weeks following the trial brought unexpected gifts. A prestigious private school offered Margaret a position specifically requesting her old-fashioned teaching methods. The Chicago Tribune featured her story on the front page, sparking a citywide conversation about education priorities and teacher respect. Most importantly, she received hundreds of letters from former students she'd lost touch with, each sharing how her influence had shaped their lives. She learned that Tommy Rodriguez, the hungry boy she'd quietly fed for 3 years, had become a doctor, specializing in pediatric care for underserved communities. Lisa Park, the shy girl she'd encouraged to join the debate team, was now a successful lawyer advocating for children's rights. The patterns emerged clearly. Her students had grown up to become helpers, teachers, healers, and leaders. They'd absorbed her lessons about compassion and service, carrying them forward into careers that made the world better. Margaret realized that her true legacy wasn't in test scores or evaluations, but in the multiplication of kindness across generations. In the end, Margaret chose not to return to formal teaching. Instead, she established the Sullivan Foundation, dedicated to supporting veteran educators facing unfair treatment and providing resources for teachers in underserved schools. The Foundation's first major initiative was creating emergency funds for teachers who, like her, found themselves vulnerable to administrative persecution. She also began speaking at education conferences, sharing her story and advocating for policies that protected experienced educators. Her message was simple but powerful. Every teacher deserves dignity. Every student deserves an advocate. And the quiet heroes of education should be celebrated, not discarded. The foundation grew rapidly, supported by former students, fellow educators, and citizens who recognized the importance of protecting those who shape our future. Margaret found new purpose in this work, understanding that her greatest teaching was yet to come, not in a classroom, but in the broader fight to honor and preserve the teaching profession itself. Margaret's story became a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of human connection. She never sought fame or recognition, but her quiet dignity in the face of injustice inspired countless others facing similar struggles. The foundation she established continues to grow, supporting teachers and transforming educational environments across the country. Her former students remain in touch, many bringing their own children to visit the woman who taught them that every person has value and every act of kindness matters. On quiet evenings in her new apartment, finally warm, finally secure, Margaret reads their letters and smiles. She thinks of David now helping other troubled children find their way, and of all the students she taught who've become teachers themselves, carrying forward the lessons of compassion she modeled every day. The world tried to make her invisible, but love made her unforgettable. Her legacy lives on in every life she touched, every student she believed in, and every teacher who refuses to give up on a child. That's the true power of education, not in the grand gestures but in the quiet moments when one person sees another's potential and helps them discover their own light. Congratulations, type 7 in the comments, so I know you stayed with me until the end. Leave a like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. See you.